The first frost had arrived long before the villagers stirred from their modest huts. As the sun dipped behind the distant hills, its fading light spilled across the frozen fields, turning the snow into a silent ocean of silver. Every tree, every fence post, every crooked roof was sheathed in icy crystals, reflecting the last rays of crimson and gold. A hush seemed to descend upon the land, broken only by the occasional whisper of wind weaving through barren branches, carrying the faint crackle of ice shifting in the cold. In this silence, the world felt suspended, as if time itself had slowed, urging the living to move cautiously, preserving warmth and energy for the long hours to come. The peasants, accustomed to these relentless winters, knew the danger that each night held. There was no warmth waiting beyond their doors. The noble halls, illuminated by roaring hearths and fragrant with smoke from carefully tended fires, were distant fantasies. Here in the lowly huts scattered across the frozen landscape, the cold was an omnipresent companion, relentless and impartial. The walls, thin and often riddled with gaps, offered little protection. Wooden planks creaked under the weight of frost, while the thatch above shivered and rattled as wind forced its way through every vulnerable seam. Even the simplest movements within these cramped homes seemed to draw the cold closer, each breath visible in icy clouds before fading into the dim air. The physical sensation of the freezing night was immediate and intimate. Fingers stiffened before they could fully move, and toes tucked deep into straw or rags refused to regain warmth. Bodies huddled instinctively together, seeking whatever heat could be shared. Sleep was never easy. It demanded compromise between comfort and survival. Every night, peasants would arrange themselves in bundles, weaving a human tapestry of warmth that allowed some measure of rest. A child nestled against a parent pressed close to another, creating rings of life that resisted the intrusion of cold. Even these measures, however, were fragile defenses against the vast indifferent winter that pressed through the walls, seeped through floors, and crept along ceilings. Outside, the landscape itself seemed to conspire with the cold. The fields were barren, stripped of their summer abundance, leaving only frozen soil to reflect the moonlight. Rivers had stiffened into opaque glass, their surfaces slick and silent, capturing shadows that danced and fractured as the wind moved across them. The air carried a sharp bite, a subtle yet persistent reminder of the night's cruelty. Breaths of frost formed tiny crystals that sparkled in the dim light, each one a fleeting jewel that vanished before it could be grasped. The forest beyond the village was a dark labyrinth, every branch and bough a rigid sculpture of ice, every path uncertain and dangerous. Even the smallest misstep in such terrain could be punished, the cold claiming flesh and strength with quiet insistence. Yet, in the midst of this austere beauty, life endured. Peasants, with their intimate knowledge of the seasons, moved with careful rhythm. They prepared not with haste, but with precision, understanding the subtle cues of frost patterns, wind shifts, and the angle of the waning sun. Their routines were rituals of survival, securing the huts against drafts, layering clothing to trap the sparse warmth of body heat, and ensuring that animals, co-workers in life and warmth, were sheltered and fed. Even the act of sitting still, waiting for night to pass, was deliberate. Every movement, every breath, every gesture mattered. Each action was a testament to endurance, a quiet defiance against the cold that claimed without prejudice. Emotionally, the night carried a weight heavier than the snowdrifts themselves. Fear was constant, though rarely spoken. Tales of frostbite, sudden death, and the unseen dangers of wandering alone were woven into the daily consciousness like a low, steady drumbeat beneath the surface of life. Yet, there was also a peculiar serenity in these winter nights. The stillness allowed reflection, a meditation upon one's own existence and connection to the land. Within the struggle, there was meaning, a rhythm, a story, a reminder that life persisted even under the most unforgiving conditions. The contrast between the warmth of the outside world and the biting cold inside the huts was stark, shaping every perception of comfort and despair. For those who had never experienced a long winter, it would be impossible to imagine the intensity of such nights. The cold was not merely an environmental condition, it was an adversary, an invisible force pressing against skin, bone, and spirit. And yet, there was dignity in endurance, a quiet strength that wove through families, binding them together as they navigated the long hours of darkness. The struggle was shared, and in that sharing, a fragile warmth emerged, not from fire, but from human connection. As darkness deepened, the villagers adapted, entering a liminal state between wakefulness and sleep. Shadows grew longer and sharper, stretching across walls and floorboards. Sounds were muted, softened by layers of snow outside. The wind's howl became a background lullaby, harsh, yet strangely rhythmic. In these moments, the peasant huts became microcosms of survival, sanctuaries of fragile warmth against the encroaching cold. Each night was both a trial and a rehearsal for the next, a slow dance with winter's silent grip. By observing the meticulous attention peasants paid to the smallest details, closing gaps in walls, layering straw bedding, adjusting clothing to conserve warmth, it becomes clear that survival was not a matter of chance, but of awareness, patience, and careful planning. Every item within the hut, every routine, every learned habit was an instrument of defense against the night. Even the silence itself had purpose, as too much noise could awaken fear or fatigue the body unnecessarily. Here, life and cold were in constant dialogue, a delicate balance maintained through quiet vigilance. The night, endless and unyielding, continued to press against them, yet within each breath, each heartbeat, each shared body, there was resistance. This resistance was subtle, almost imperceptible, but profound. It was the essence of peasant endurance, a slow, steady assertion of life in defiance of the night's icy dominion. The beauty of the frozen landscape, the hush of falling snow, and the gentle choreography of survival merged into an atmosphere that was both harsh and mesmerizing. By witnessing these moments, one gains not only an understanding of historical reality, but a sense of awe for the human capacity to endure, adapt, and find warmth in the coldest of times. Even as the moon rose high above the village, casting pale light across snow-laden rooftops, the peasants remained vigilant. The night stretched before them, silent yet demanding, cold yet instructive, and within that silence, within the intimate embrace of endurance, life persisted. Winter's grip, formidable and unrelenting, shaped not only the land, but the hearts and minds of those who inhabited it. In learning how they faced this frozen world, we come to see resilience, not as a dramatic triumph, but as a quiet, persistent presence, unfolding night after night, breath by breath, heartbeat by heartbeat. For the medieval peasant, life was a delicate negotiation with uncertainty. Every dawn brought both routine and risk. Yet the approach of winter magnified every vulnerability. Food was scarce, clothing thin, and shelter fragile. The cold did not merely chill the body, it exposed the fragility of existence, magnifying the consequences of even the smallest missteps. Each day was a test of endurance, each night a trial of survival. To inhabit this world was to live continuously on the edge, where the margin between life and despair was perilously thin. The villagers moved with measured care, their eyes constantly aware of the environment around them. Even the simplest chores, drawing water, chopping wood, or tending livestock, were undertaken with an understanding that mistakes could prove costly. Fingers stiffened in the cold, tools became slippery with frost, and the earth itself resisted every step. Paths once familiar were transformed by snow and ice, turning them into uncertain corridors of danger. Peasants relied not only on skill, but on memory and intuition, recalling every hollow and ridge that might threaten a stumble or the loss of precious warmth. Food scarcity was a constant gnawing worry. Stored grains, roots and salted meats were carefully rationed, sometimes down to the very last handful. Peasants learned to stretch provisions with creativity, boiling grain into porridge, fermenting vegetables to last through weeks of snow, or using scraps to flavor broths that offered both sustenance and psychological comfort. The ritual of preparing meals, slow and deliberate, provided a rhythm to life, a sense of control amid the unpredictability of winter's reach. Even a modest portion of food brought a measure of hope, a reminder that survival, though tenuous, remained possible. Physical hardship was relentless. Frostbite crept unnoticed into fingers and toes, slowing movement and dulling sensation. The body's natural warmth was precious, and every lost ounce of heat could not easily be regained. Clothing, though layered, often fell short against the penetrating cold. Peasants learned to adapt, twisting straw into makeshift insulators, layering rough-spun wool, and pressing close to neighbors for shared warmth. Every night became a careful choreography of bodies, a silent ballet in which proximity to warmth determined the difference between discomfort and danger. Yet hardship was not solely a matter of survival. It shaped character, awareness, and community. In a world so exposed to elemental forces, human connections became essential. Families huddled together in tiny huts, children wrapped against their parents, and elders placed at the center to maximize warmth. This constant physical proximity created bonds, a shared understanding of vulnerability and resilience. The hardships of winter demanded not only endurance but empathy, attentiveness, and cooperation. Each night was a lesson in interdependence, a recognition that life was preserved not in isolation, but in collective care. The cold also imposed a rhythm on daily labor. Work was conducted with deliberate efficiency, conserving energy for the hours when no movement could generate heat. Tasks were scheduled according to the sun, the wind, and the frost. Farmers often rose before dawn to complete the most demanding chores while the air was still manageable, retreating to shelter when the cold deepened. Even leisure was measured, a scarce resource that could not justify unnecessary exposure. Life was punctuated by these cycles of activity and rest, a careful negotiation with the forces beyond human control. Psychologically, the ever-present winter shaped thought and behavior. Fear was constant, but tempered by acceptance. Superstitions, rituals, and local customs provided structure and reassurance, offering a sense of predictability in a world that was otherwise capricious. The villagers' minds were trained to notice subtle environmental changes, shifts in wind, the angle of sunlight on snow, the scent of frost on earth, all signals of potential danger or opportunity. Survival was as much a matter of mental acuity as physical endurance, a delicate balance between vigilance and calm, alertness and measured patience. The peasant diet, though humble, played a role in sustaining both body and spirit. Preservation techniques allowed food to last, yet the monotony of winter meals imposed its own hardship. Each bite was a reminder of scarcity, yet also of ingenuity. Porridges thickened with grains, soups flavored with dried herbs, and the occasional piece of smoked meat were not merely nutrition, they were affirmations of life. Even small indulgences, a warmed loaf, a handful of nuts offered psychological warmth that complemented the body's physical defenses. Animals were vital companions in this delicate balance. Chickens, goats, and pigs provided more than food, they generated heat, their bodies a living reservoir of warmth. Livestock were often brought close to human dwellings, sharing confined spaces to ward off frost. This interdependence was emblematic of the peasant's worldview. Survival relied not on solitary strength, but on the harmonious use of available resources. The bond between human and animal became both practical and emotional, a subtle comfort in the long dark hours. The environmental dangers extended beyond cold alone. Winter storms could strike with sudden violence, flattening crops, breaching fences, and burying paths. The peasant had to be ready with reinforced structures, stored provisions, and contingency plans for emergencies. Even in the absence of extreme weather, the everyday hazards of frost and ice demanded constant attention. Each step, each movement, each breath had to be calculated to minimize exposure and preserve vitality. There was no room for carelessness. The cold punished without prejudice, indifferent to status, age, or strength. Social structures shaped winter life as well. Villagers relied on each other not only for warmth, but for guidance and assistance. Shared labor, whether in tending livestock, fetching water, or repairing structures, was essential. News, advice, and strategies for coping with the cold were exchanged in whispered conversations by dim light. In these moments, the peasant community functioned as a single organism, each member contributing to the survival of the whole. Isolation, though inevitable at times, was softened by the pervasive sense of collective responsibility and shared struggle. Despite these hardships, there were moments of quiet wonder. The frost-laden landscape, bathed in moonlight or early dawn, held a stark beauty that contrasted with the daily struggle. Snowflakes drifting onto darkened fields, icicles hanging like fragile sculptures, and the crystalline shimmer of frozen rivers offered fleeting visual reprieves from the monotony of toil. Such moments reminded the peasants that even amidst adversity, life possessed moments of grace and aesthetic splendor, an understated reward for enduring the relentless winter. Sleep, when it came, was a precious refuge. It was never deep or undisturbed, but carefully managed to retain warmth and preserve energy. Beds were simple arrangements of straw and rags, layered to trap the minimal heat available. Families positioned themselves strategically, bodies interlaced to create circles of shared warmth. Even in sleep, awareness lingered, subtle sounds, drafts through gaps in walls and changes in temperature demanded attention. Night became both a trial and a teacher, instructing patience, resilience, and the quiet art of endurance. Life on the edge was therefore a continuous negotiation between vulnerability and ingenuity. Every action, from tending a fireless hearth to layering straw bedding, was imbued with intention. The peasant's survival was not a matter of luck, but of persistent, deliberate practice. They learned to read the environment, anticipate danger, and cultivate both physical and emotional reserves. In this precarious existence, life was a subtle victory, a testament to human resilience and the quiet dignity of endurance. And so, as the night deepened and the wind rattled against the fragile huts, the peasants moved, breathed, and slept with purpose. Every gesture, every thought, every shared warmth contributed to the invisible web of survival. Life on the edge was not merely about avoiding death, it was about understanding one's place within the cold, vast world, adapting to its rhythms, and finding moments of warmth, literal and metaphorical, amidst the stark silence of winter. The medieval peasant hut, modest and unassuming at first glance, was a marvel of simplicity and practical ingenuity. Each structure was crafted from the materials the land provided: timber from nearby forests, straw harvested from summer fields, and mud drawn from riverbanks. Though these dwellings lacked the grandeur of noble halls, they were carefully constructed to balance economy with survival, designed to shield fragile human bodies from the relentless forces of winter. To stand before one of these huts in the pale light of dawn was to glimpse a world both austere and intimate, a microcosm of endurance, shaped by necessity. From the outside, the hut appeared humble, almost fragile, yet every element had purpose. Thatched roofs, woven tightly from bundles of straw or reeds, were designed to shed snow and rain while trapping pockets of insulating air. Each layer of thatch was meticulously laid, overlapping like shingles, and tied with cords or twine to resist gusting winds. Beneath, walls of wattle and daub, interwoven wooden branches coated in a mixture of mud, clay, and straw, provided a surprisingly resilient barrier. Cracks were inevitable, yet peasants often reinforced them with additional clay, animal hair, or scraps of cloth, knowing that even the smallest gaps could admit the bitter cold. Windows, if present at all, were tiny and covered with oiled parchment or thin layers of cloth, enough to admit dim light, but not enough to compromise warmth. The floors were packed earth, sometimes raised slightly to avoid dampness, and often layered with straw or rushes to provide some insulation against the icy ground. Each element, though simple, reflected a careful understanding of the environment. The hut was not a place of comfort in the modern sense. It was a carefully calibrated machine for survival, a container of heat and human life amidst the vast chill of winter. Inside, the spatial arrangement was deliberate, reflecting both practicality and the rhythms of daily life. The hearth, if one existed, occupied a central position, not for grandiose cooking, but for the modest task of boiling water or simmering thin broths. In many huts, fire was scarce or entirely absent during the coldest nights, meaning the architecture itself had to compensate. Low ceilings helped trap the warmth generated by body heat, while alcoves or raised platforms held straw bedding in the warmest corners. Every placement, every layer of straw, every hanging bundle of herbs or dried vegetables was intentional, contributing to both warmth and efficiency. Bedding was a crucial component, meticulously arranged to conserve what little heat was available. Straw rushes and rags were layered thickly to provide insulation from the cold earthen floor. Sheets or coarse blankets, if present, were treasured possessions, often patched and reinforced repeatedly over the years. Families slept closely together, bodies intertwined to create concentric rings of shared warmth. Children were positioned near parents, while adults often aligned along the warmest edges. The arrangement was a subtle science, learned through experience and necessity, a strategy to survive night after night with minimal fire. The hut's interior, though Spartan, was alive with textures and details. Wooden beams, darkened with age and smoke, crossed the ceilings in irregular patterns. The walls were often adorned with functional items, woven baskets, wooden utensils and simple tools hung within reach, keeping essentials accessible while maintaining order in a confined space. Every object served multiple purposes, reducing clutter and maximizing utility. Even the smells of the hut, the earthy scent of mud, the faint tang of straw, the lingering odor of livestock, were part of the environment, grounding the inhabitants in a sensory landscape intimately connected to survival. Light, or the lack thereof, shaped perception of the space. During winter, daylight was brief, and the hut existed largely in dim, shifting shadows. Flickers of candlelight or the rare hearth fire cast moving patterns on walls, creating an almost hypnotic interplay of light and dark. These shadows enhanced the sense of enclosure, reinforcing both security and the ever-present threat of cold. The interplay of light and texture contributed to the sensory experience of the hut, making it more than a mere shelter, but a lived environment, a tactile and visual map of survival. Airflow was another subtle but essential element. Though gaps in walls could admit cold, they also allowed stale air to escape, preventing suffocation or buildup of moisture. Peasants understood this delicate balance, sealing some gaps while leaving others to encourage ventilation. The interior microclimate of the hut was a constantly negotiated equilibrium, where the slightest miscalculation could tip the balance toward freezing discomfort or suffocating damp. Mastery of this environment required acute observation and practical wisdom, honed over years of experience and careful attention to seasonal changes. The hut's relationship to the outside world was equally vital. Positioned to take advantage of natural barriers, hillsides, clusters of trees, or neighboring structures, the placement minimized exposure to wind and drifting snow. Surrounding fences or hedges offered limited protection while containing livestock that could provide both warmth and sustenance. Peasants observed the sun and moon, noting their trajectories and the angles at which light and warmth entered the hut. Every decision, from orientation to doorway size, reflected an ongoing dialogue with nature, a negotiation between human need and environmental reality. Livestock, when accommodated inside, were carefully integrated into the hut's interior design. Small pens or partitions kept animals close enough to share warmth without overwhelming the human space. The heat radiating from goats, chickens or pigs contributed significantly to the ambient temperature, often making the difference between tolerable cold and life-threatening chill. Beyond warmth, these animals symbolized both practicality and hope, a tangible source of sustenance and security amid the uncertain rhythms of winter. Storage and organization were inseparable from survival. Food supplies, tools, and personal belongings were arranged to minimize exposure and maximize accessibility. Herbs hung from beams to dry, grains were stored in containers elevated from the floor, and water was kept in clay or wooden vessels, protected from freezing. Even the most mundane items were imbued with purpose. Every placement was deliberate, a reflection of the peasant's intimate knowledge of winter hazards. The hut functioned as a miniature ecosystem, balancing human needs, environmental forces, and practical constraints in an intricate web of survival. The psychological impact of such a confined, dimly lit space should not be underestimated. Though small, the hut offered a sense of enclosure and relative security, a protective shell against the indifference of the winter landscape. Its walls, though thin, marked the boundary between life and the harsh night. The spatial intimacy reinforced familial bonds and community interdependence, shaping both behavior and perception. To inhabit the hut was to learn subtle rhythms of body, space, and time, to adjust and anticipate, and to find comfort in measured routine and proximity. Yet despite these adaptations, the hut was never truly warm in the modern sense. It was a space of negotiation, where body heat, straw insulation, and careful positioning replaced roaring fires. Comfort was relative, warmth was earned and preserved through diligence, knowledge and cooperation. It was in this fragile balance that the peasant's ingenuity shone brightest, a testament to human resilience, adaptability, and the quiet art of survival. As winter nights deepened, the hut became more than a shelter. It was a stage for endurance, a theater where every breath, movement, and gesture contributed to the ongoing struggle against the cold. Within these humble walls, life persisted through observation, careful arrangement, and shared effort. The anatomy of the hut, its structure, materials, and interior life, revealed the intimate dialogue between human ingenuity and environmental challenge. A balance that allowed generations to endure, survive, and quietly triumph over the relentless grip of winter. In the harsh, unyielding winters of medieval Europe, clothing was not simply a matter of style or modesty, it was a matter of life and death. Peasants, with limited resources and little access to luxury, relied on layers of wool, linen, and animal hides to shield themselves from the penetrating chill. Each garment was carefully crafted, patched, and layered, transforming simple fabrics into intricate systems of insulation. To observe a peasant preparing for a winter night was to witness a ritual of survival, where every fold, layer, and knot served a deliberate function in the ongoing battle against cold. The base layer, usually made of coarse linen, was closest to the skin. Its role was subtle but essential to wick away moisture from sweat, preventing the chilling dampness that could penetrate subsequent layers. Over this, woolen tunics and stockings provided the bulk of insulation. Wool, dense and resilient, retained warmth even when slightly damp, making it invaluable in conditions where exposure to snow and ice was unavoidable. Each garment was often hand-woven, sometimes dyed with muted colors from natural plant extracts, yet functionality always outweighed decoration. Every stitch represented careful attention, honed through experience and necessity. Outer garments were larger and heavier, designed to trap air between layers and create a buffer against the wind. Cloaks and mantles, often made from multiple woolen pieces stitched together, draped over the shoulders, wrapping the body in a protective cocoon. These cloaks were not elegant in the sense of noble fashion, but they were effective, long enough to cover legs, sometimes hooded to shield the head and neck, and occasionally lined with scraps of fur or additional cloth for extra insulation. Even the placement of seams and folds was deliberate, reducing points of heat loss and maximizing coverage without restricting movement. Hats and hoods were indispensable. The head, often overlooked in modern clothing, was a critical point of heat loss. Peasants covered their heads with layers of wool or fur, sometimes binding cloth beneath the chin to secure warmth around the neck. Mittens or gloves, rarely perfect in fit, were thick and layered, protecting fingers from frostbite, while allowing some dexterity for necessary tasks. Footwear, often constructed from sturdy leather, was sometimes lined with straw, cloth, or animal hides to create an additional barrier between frozen ground and tender toes. Even soles were sometimes reinforced with layered materials, preventing the cold from seeping upward with each step. Every layer of clothing was a testament to ingenuity. Scarce materials were repurposed, patched, or reinforced repeatedly, transforming old garments into functional composites of warmth. A tunic might have elbows reinforced with leather, knees patched with extra wool, or the lining stuffed with straw to increase insulation. Socks and mittens were sometimes crafted from mismatched pieces of cloth, but their effectiveness was undiminished. In the absence of modern tailoring or manufacturing, survival depended on the peasant's ability to improvise, combining resourcefulness with meticulous care to create protective armor against the cold. The process of dressing for winter was itself a slow and deliberate ritual. Layer by layer, the peasant added insulation, ensuring that each garment fit snugly without restricting circulation. Tight cords or belts were used not for decoration, but to trap warmth close to the torso. Hoods were adjusted to cover ears, cheeks, and the back of the neck, minimizing exposure to wind. Even sleeping attire was layered, with individuals keeping the outermost garments nearby to reuse during the night, maintaining continuity of warmth. The act of dressing became both a physical and psychological preparation, a way of asserting control over an otherwise indifferent environment. Children, in particular, were wrapped with special attention. Their smaller bodies lost heat more rapidly, and frostbite or hypothermia could strike swiftly. Parents layered children in miniature versions of adult garments, often binding them snugly in swaddling cloths or thick blankets. The shared warmth of bodies became especially crucial for the youngest members of the household. Even slight lapses in coverage could have serious consequences, making vigilance an unspoken but constant part of peasant life. Clothing also conveyed subtle signals of status and resource availability. While all peasants faced the same brutal winter conditions, variations in garment quality, patchwork skill, and layering often reflected household resources or ingenuity. A well-patched tunic, carefully layered stockings, or a fur-lined cloak could signify experience and wisdom in survival techniques. Conversely, poorly fitted or thin garments increased vulnerability, underscoring the delicate balance between scarcity and necessity that defined peasant winter life. The sensory experience of these garments was as important as their functionality. The scratch of wool, the coarse texture of linen, and the faint smell of animal hide became constants in daily existence. Wearing multiple layers required adjustment and adaptation. Each movement produced a subtle friction, a reminder of both protection and constraint. Yet the physical sensations were accompanied by comfort, a warm envelope against the harsh, biting winds outside. Clothing became a second skin, a buffer that allowed life to continue within the cold, harsh landscape. Even as night fell and temperatures plunged further, clothing remained the primary defense against the elements. Where fire was scarce or absent, layered garments absorbed and conserved body heat, providing a sanctuary in miniature. Peasants learned, over years, to adjust, tighten, loosen, or add layers in response to changing conditions. They monitored their own bodies, recognizing signs of frostbite, cold, fatigue, or discomfort, and adapted accordingly. Every layer was an act of mindfulness, a continuous negotiation with both the body and the environment. In combination with spatial strategies within the hut, positioning near walls, close contact with family, and layering straw or rags beneath the body, clothing completed a holistic system of survival. Each component was interdependent. Clothing preserved heat that the hut's design sought to retain, and the hut's microclimate allowed garments to function effectively. The careful attention to fabrics, layering, and fit was not mere practicality. It was an art form born of necessity, a quiet mastery of human ingenuity in response to relentless winter. Through these garments, peasants achieved a fragile autonomy. They could withstand long nights, endure gusting winds, and resist the chilling touch of frozen ground. Each stitch, each layer, and each patch represented more than warmth. It symbolized knowledge, preparation, and resilience. The winter night was relentless, but through careful attention to clothing, humans asserted their presence, defended their bodies, and preserved life. The protective embrace of wool, linen, and hide became a tangible expression of survival, a personal armor against the quiet tyranny of cold. In this way, clothing was inseparable from the peasant's experience of winter. It shaped movement, dictated routines, and provided both physical and psychological comfort. It reflected resourcefulness, adaptation, and human creativity. And above all, it allowed life to persist, quiet and enduring, within the frozen embrace of the medieval night. Without these layered garments, the cold would have claimed countless lives. With them, survival became possible even amidst despair, deprivation, and the long, relentless hours of darkness. When fire was scarce or absent, survival demanded creativity. Peasants faced long, freezing nights, with no blazing hearths to chase away the cold. Yet within these humble dwellings, ingenuity became the most reliable source of warmth. The human mind, pressed to its limits by necessity, devised solutions that combined simplicity, resourcefulness, and practicality. Every household, no matter how poor, became a small laboratory of survival, experimenting with materials, arrangements, and behaviors to endure hours of penetrating chill. Straw, humble and abundant, became a cornerstone of winter survival. Layered on floors, it insulated against the frozen earth, creating a buffer between human bodies and the cold ground. Straw was also piled into corners and along walls, acting as a passive heat trap. Its structure captured pockets of air, reducing drafts and maintaining the minimal warmth generated by body heat. Even the act of lying down involved strategy. Beds were oriented toward the warmest sections of the hut, often near walls that retained residual heat from the day, and straw was adjusted beneath and around the body to prevent contact with icy surfaces. Shared sleeping arrangements were equally ingenious. Families, and even neighbors, would huddle together, intertwining bodies to conserve warmth. The more occupants in a confined space, the more heat could be retained. This was not mere proximity, it was a carefully learned choreography of positioning. Children were nestled against adults, while adults positioned themselves to shield the young and frail from drafts. Limbs were arranged to minimize exposed surfaces, and blankets or rags were tucked strategically around shoulders and feet. The design was intuitive, yet deliberate, a silent science of human thermoregulation developed over generations. Huts themselves were adapted to enhance warmth without fire. Gaps in walls and roofs, unavoidable in rustic construction, were blocked with whatever materials were at hand. Bundles of straw, scraps of cloth, even mud applied hastily to cracks. Heavy doors or curtains made from layered textiles reduced drafts at entrances, and windbreaks, hedges, fences or piles of snow were positioned to deflect icy gusts. Every element of the hut's interior and exterior was part of a system that maximized insulation and minimized energy loss. A holistic approach to surviving the unrelenting winter. Clothing complemented these structural solutions. Peasants layered garments meticulously, adjusting each piece in response to the temperature and activity level. When moving, extra layers could be loosened to prevent sweating, then reapplied when rest required preservation of warmth. Patches and reinforcements were not just repairs, they were enhancements, strategically placed to trap heat in the most vulnerable areas: elbows, knees, and feet. The combination of layered clothing, thoughtful positioning, and insulating straw transformed the humble hut into a functioning microclimate, carefully tuned to extend human endurance. Animals were integrated into this system of ingenuity. Livestock provided both heat and security. Cows, goats, and pigs were often brought into close quarters, their body warmth radiating into the living space. Chickens huddled on perches or in small pens, sharing residual heat, while even smaller animals contributed a faint but perceptible difference in ambient warmth. The presence of animals also had psychological effects. Their soft sounds and warmth provided comfort and a sense of continuity, helping villagers endure long silent nights with resilience. Peasants also turned to inventive methods for conserving and generating heat in other ways. Dried herbs or straw could be placed near the body to release faint warmth, while compact arrangements of bedding created microenvironments that retained heat efficiently. Some villages employed the clever practice of rotating sleeping locations each night, alternating spots that received sunlight during the day with areas that were slightly warmer due to structural factors. Such adaptations reflected careful observation of the natural and built environment, turning passive features into life-saving assets. The human mind found even small sources of light and warmth to be emotionally powerful. Candles, when available, were used sparingly. Their flame provided not only illumination, but also a tiny amount of heat and a sense of psychological comfort. Peasants learned to maximize their utility, positioning candles near corners or reflective surfaces to enhance light, protecting them from drafts, and using them only for essential tasks. Even brief exposure to a flame could be restorative, offering a sense of control amid an environment otherwise dominated by cold and darkness. Communal ingenuity extended beyond individual households. Villagers exchanged strategies, sharing knowledge about insulation, layering, and animal management. Practical wisdom became a currency as valuable as food or firewood. Advice might include simple but effective techniques, such as doubling straw layers near doorways, creating partitions with textiles, or using certain herbs to repel insects while subtly warming the air. Knowledge accumulated and traveled with the seasons, an informal but vital network of survival intelligence. Psychological strategies complemented physical adaptations. Peasants trained themselves to manage perception, modulating movements, conserving energy, and maintaining focus. Silence was deliberate, both to conserve heat and to reduce stress on the body. Even simple breathing techniques, slow, steady inhalations, helped regulate warmth and conserve energy. Mental focus became an essential component of survival. Attention to subtle environmental cues, personal bodily signals, and household arrangements allowed peasants to extend endurance across the long dark hours. Ingenuity also manifested in small comforts that sustained morale. Simple rituals, quiet songs and storytelling around the faint glow of a candle or hearth helped maintain mental resilience. While not a substitute for warmth, these practices reduced perceived cold by engaging the mind and reinforcing social bonds. Shared narratives, whispers of history, and stories of survival became tools of endurance, blending psychological and physical strategies in a seamless defense against winter's severity. Even in moments of extreme deprivation, ingenuity persisted. Peasants discovered ways to recycle and repurpose scraps, turning worn garments into insulation, or patching walls with mud and straw. Broken furniture could be dismantled and layered to create additional warmth. Such resourcefulness was born of necessity, yet it reflected a profound understanding of materials and their properties. Every action demonstrated both creativity and practicality, a testament to human adaptability under relentless pressure. In essence, these measures were a quiet triumph of the human spirit. Peasants had no access to modern heating, yet they crafted an ecosystem of survival, combining architecture, clothing, animal warmth, and psychological strategies into a coherent system. Their ingenuity was subtle, often invisible to outsiders, yet it defined life during the harshest months. Night after night, they faced freezing darkness, not passively, but with deliberate action, observation, and adaptation, creating a fragile equilibrium between vulnerability and endurance. Through these practices, peasants demonstrated that survival was not solely dependent on resources or external assistance. It was an active process, a constant negotiation between human ingenuity and environmental challenge. Every layer of clothing, every straw-filled bed, every huddled body, and every careful observation contributed to life persevering in conditions that could have been insurmountable. In the quiet darkness, ingenuity became a lifeline, transforming the cold, indifferent night into a navigable landscape, manageable and even predictable through careful attention and human creativity. By witnessing the inventive solutions peasants employed, we gain not only insight into historical life, but also a deep appreciation for the quiet resilience that defined it. Survival was never guaranteed, yet it was continually crafted through observation, experimentation, and adaptation. The cold, vast, and silent world of winter nights was formidable, yet within the modest huts, amid straw, cloth, and body heat, ingenuity prevailed. It was here in the intersection of necessity and invention that human endurance found its most profound expression. In the frozen nights of medieval winters, animals were not merely companions or sources of food, they were vital partners in survival. Peasants relied on the warmth, labor, and sustenance that livestock and domesticated creatures provided, weaving them into daily life in ways that transcended simple utility. Every cow, goat, pig, and chicken contributed to a complex system of survival, offering body heat, nourishment, and psychological reassurance against the long, harsh nights. Their presence, subtle yet indispensable, transformed huts from mere shelters into living ecosystems, where the boundary between human and animal life blurred in the pursuit of endurance. Cattle were often the primary source of warmth and sustenance. In the coldest months, cows were sometimes brought closer to the living quarters, or into small pens adjacent to the hut walls. Their large bodies radiated heat steadily, helping to warm the surrounding space. Even a single cow could make a measurable difference, its warmth seeping into the walls and floors, slightly elevating ambient temperature and improving human comfort. Beyond heat, cows provided milk, which could be consumed fresh or processed into cheese, a vital source of calories and nutrients during a season when other food was scarce. Goats and sheep were similarly essential. Smaller and more agile, they often shared the hut itself, huddled in corners or pen spaces arranged to maximize shared warmth. Their wool provided insulation not only on their own bodies, but also indirectly, as the dense material retained heat within confined spaces. Milk from these animals supplemented human nutrition, often forming the base of broths, porridge, or simple cheeses. The presence of these animals also offered reassurance. Their rhythmic breathing, movement, and occasional sounds became a quiet reminder that life persisted even in the long cold hours of darkness. Pigs, too, played a unique role in the winter ecosystem. While generally housed separately due to smell and size, their pens were positioned strategically to benefit both animals and humans. Like cows and goats, pigs radiated heat that seeped into nearby living spaces. Additionally, pigs could consume food scraps and leftovers, effectively recycling resources that would otherwise be wasted, providing both a practical and ecological benefit. Their survival, in turn, was a small form of economic security for the household, offering meat when other sources dwindled. Chickens, though small, contributed surprisingly to warmth and sustenance. Their perches were often placed inside pens or along walls of huts, where their body heat could be partially absorbed by the structure. Eggs, if available, were carefully collected and rationed, providing a vital protein source. Chickens' constant activity, scratching and pecking, brought life into the otherwise static frozen environment, offering a subtle psychological uplift that contrasted with the oppressive stillness of winter nights. Animals also influenced the architecture and interior organization of the hut. Pens and partitions were arranged to maximize the spread of heat without compromising human space. The strategic positioning of livestock near doors, walls, or high-traffic zones reflected generations of observation and trial-and-error adaptation. Even small adjustments, moving a goat slightly closer to a human sleeping area, stacking straw around a pig pen, could have measurable effects on warmth and comfort. In this way, the animals and humans coexisted in a delicate equilibrium, each supporting the survival of the other. Beyond warmth and food, animals contributed significantly to the psychological resilience of peasants. The quiet presence of a cow, the rhythmic breathing of a goat, or the soft clucking of a hen provided sensory anchors in otherwise dark, silent nights. These sounds and movements, subtle yet consistent, reinforced a sense of continuity, safety, and companionship. In an environment dominated by cold and uncertainty, such signals became crucial markers of life, reminding humans that they were not alone, and that the struggle against winter was shared. Labor was another critical dimension of the human-animal relationship. Animals were essential for plowing, transporting firewood, or carrying water during the day, reducing physical strain on the human body, and allowing energy to be conserved for survival during the long night. Even smaller tasks, milking, feeding, or maintaining pens, became part of a structured routine, blending human and animal efforts into a coordinated system of endurance. Each day reinforced bonds, knowledge, and mutual dependence, ensuring that both humans and animals navigated the harsh conditions together. Animals were also central to peasant ingenuity. Their waste was collected and reused as fuel or fertilizer, creating subtle feedback loops that enhanced survival prospects. Manure could be dried and burned to provide warmth, or added to soil for spring planting, ensuring future food security. Even discarded straw or bedding became resources for insulation, demonstrating a holistic understanding of ecosystem efficiency. This careful cyclical use of animals' presence exemplified a practical intelligence born of necessity, combining survival, resource management, and environmental awareness into a seamless strategy. Care of the animals was therefore inseparable from human survival. Peasants monitored health, diet, and shelter, knowing that an unwell or poorly insulated animal could quickly jeopardize both warmth and food supply. Layering straw over pens, adjusting bedding, or positioning animals near the sunniest parts of the yard were small but essential measures. Livestock required attention, but their survival, in turn, sustained human life, creating a symbiotic relationship that defined winter existence. Even in moments of extreme cold or scarcity, the ingenuity of peasants and their animals persisted. Practices evolved to maximize heat retention, stacking hay near sleeping areas, using livestock as natural windbreaks, or adjusting pen locations in response to snowdrifts and prevailing winds. The solutions were simple yet effective, grounded in careful observation and a deep understanding of both animal behavior and environmental forces. Life became a continuous exercise in optimization, where every creature and material had a deliberate role in maintaining equilibrium. Animals also provided subtle emotional sustenance. Their presence encouraged mindfulness, responsibility, and empathy. Caring for them demanded attention, patience, and observation, creating routines that structured the day and mitigated despair. In a world where external conditions were often beyond control, these relationships gave peasants agency, fostering confidence and resilience in the face of relentless cold. The bond between human and animal became an emotional, as well as practical, lifeline, intertwining survival with companionship. By understanding the role of animals in peasant life, we gain insight not only into practical survival strategies, but also into the interconnectedness of life in extreme conditions. The warmth of a goat, the milk of a cow, and the eggs of a chicken were more than resources. They were integral to the daily choreography of endurance. They shaped routines, architecture, clothing, strategies, and social structures. They provided warmth, food, labor, and psychological comfort, creating a multifaceted safety net in a world dominated by winter's severity. Ultimately, the presence of animals transformed the cold, dark hut into a dynamic microcosm of life. Humans and animals coexisted, each supporting the other through ingenuity, adaptation, and shared resilience. Every breath, movement, and gesture was part of a delicate, continuous negotiation between survival and environment. Without these creatures, peasants would have faced far greater challenges, yet with them life persisted even amid the most relentless winter nights. Animals were not merely companions, they were co-authors in the story of endurance, partners in navigating a frozen, indifferent world, and indispensable actors in the quiet, patient triumph of human survival. As dusk fell, and the last streaks of pale sunlight disappeared beyond the horizon, the peasant village transformed into a quiet, shadowed world. Nighttime brought its own rhythms, its own set of challenges, and an unspoken series of routines that had been honed over generations. With fire scarce or absent, the approach of darkness demanded deliberate preparation, careful organization, and the subtle choreography of survival. Every movement, every adjustment of clothing, bedding, or animal placement was part of a practiced ritual, ensuring that warmth and life could endure through hours of cold and silence. The first steps of nightfall were practical. Families ensured that doors were closed as tightly as possible, gaps blocked with bundles of straw, scraps of cloth, or clumps of mud. Windows, if they existed, were covered with oiled parchment or layered cloth to reduce heat loss. Livestock were attended to. Cows, goats, and pigs were brought closer to the hut or their pens reinforced to provide both warmth and security. Chickens were gathered from open yards and placed on perches or small enclosures inside, their bodies radiating faint but essential heat. These preparations were deliberate and methodical, performed in near silence to conserve energy and avoid startling animals. With the environment secured, attention turned inward. Bedding arrangements were a careful process. Layers of straw, rushes, and rags were fluffed, adjusted, and positioned to insulate against the cold earth. Blankets or patched cloth were arranged strategically, often forming a protective cocoon around the sleeping bodies. Family members were positioned with intention, children nestled close to adults, elders placed at the center or near the warmest sections of the hut, and adults forming barriers against drafts and cold corners. The positioning was a subtle dance of heat conservation, learned over years of experience and observation. Clothing rituals continued as part of nighttime routines. Additional layers were applied if temperatures had dropped sharply, hoods adjusted to cover exposed areas, and mittens or socks arranged to protect extremities. Even while resting, peasants often retained key garments near the body, ready to provide warmth if the night grew colder. The act of dressing and adjusting clothing was deliberate and mindful, emphasizing control in an environment that offered little room for error. Each layer, each fold, each tuck of fabric contributed to a fragile equilibrium that allowed life to persist. Food, carefully rationed, played a subtle role in evening routines. Small portions of porridge, broth, or cheese were consumed to provide warmth from within, nourishing the body and sustaining energy through the night. Water was kept nearby in clay or wooden vessels, often wrapped in cloth to prevent freezing. Even the act of eating followed a quiet, deliberate rhythm, mindful of conserving energy and maximizing the effect of limited resources. Meals were modest, yet every bite carried significance, a reinforcement of survival, a ritual of preparation for the long hours ahead. Attention to animals remained constant, even after the initial arrangements. Livestock and poultry were checked one final time before settling for the night. The subtle movements of animals, their breathing and sounds were monitored carefully. Any signs of distress, discomfort, or misplacement could require minor adjustments, moving a goat closer to the sleeping area, rearranging straw around a pig's pen, or closing a draft near chickens. Animals were not passive participants. They were active components of the night's microclimate, their warmth and presence carefully integrated into human routines. Silence became a critical companion. Movement was minimized, speech reduced to whispers, and children were gently hushed. Conservation of energy and heat became paramount, with quiet allowing bodies to maintain warmth more effectively. The hush of nighttime was punctuated only by necessary actions, the rustle of straw, the soft cluck of a chicken, or the occasional sigh of a resting cow. These subtle sounds were comforting as well as functional, marking life and presence within a world otherwise dominated by cold and shadow. The peasants' minds also engaged in preparation. Evening routines included mental rehearsal of the night ahead, anticipating temperature changes, planning movements, and noting areas where drafts might need attention. Awareness of the environment was never fully suspended, even in rest. Attention remained partially active, tuned to subtle cues such as wind shifts, changes in temperature, or the faint sounds of approaching weather. This vigilance, though gentle and calm, was essential, blending intuition with routine to extend endurance through hours of darkness. For children, nighttime routines were both protective and comforting. Parents wrapped them carefully, ensuring warmth while also offering a sense of security. Gentle touch, hushed stories, and quiet songs provided emotional comfort, fostering psychological resilience, in addition to physical protection. The repetition of these routines, layering, positioning, and close proximity, instilled predictability in a world of uncertainty. The rhythm of care, the soft murmur of adults, and the warmth of shared bodies became a nightly ritual that blended practicality with emotional sustenance. In the absence of fire, subtle strategies were employed to preserve warmth throughout the night. Straw or rags were rearranged if settling revealed cold spots, and bodies were subtly shifted to optimize heat distribution. Doors or makeshift curtains could be checked, adjusting for wind shifts or drafts. Even minor gestures, such as tucking a blanket more tightly around shoulders or shifting closer to a sibling, contributed to a larger system of survival. Nighttime routines were dynamic, responsive, and continuous, a silent choreography of adaptation. Rituals of observation were also integral. Peasants paid attention to the weather, noting the faint crunch of ice, the smell of frost, or the angle of moonlight through small windows. These cues provided foresight into the coming night, allowing adjustments to bedding, clothing, or animal placement. Survival was not passive, it was an active process, combining sensory awareness, careful preparation, and continuous monitoring. The night, though cold and dark, became navigable through experience, observation, and practiced routines. Even in sleep, nighttime routines extended their influence. Bodies remained close, layered clothing preserved warmth, and attention lingered in semi-conscious states. The microclimate of the hut, the distribution of animals, and the careful layering of bedding continued to protect inhabitants through unconscious hours. Sleep itself became a carefully managed state, neither deep nor careless, yet restorative enough to allow endurance until the sun returned. Every routine established before nightfall ensured that life persisted quietly, calmly, and steadily. Through these nightly rituals, the peasant household transformed the darkness into a manageable and even predictable space. Each action, though small, contributed to a broader system of survival. The careful arrangement of bodies, the layering of straw and clothing, the placement of animals, and the observant attention of minds aware of subtle environmental changes. Nighttime routines were not merely practical, they were a choreography of life, blending ingenuity, experience and care into a system that allowed human life to endure the harshest months of the year. In this quiet world, the rhythms of dusk and night carried both challenge and subtle comfort. The cold was never absent, yet it was managed, mitigated, and softened through deliberate, careful routines. Life persisted in this fragile equilibrium, and within the hut, a sense of rhythm, order and shared warmth made survival possible. Nighttime routines were more than habit, they were a form of mastery, a quiet assertion of control and resilience in the face of winter's relentless and indifferent darkness. Winter nights brought more than cold, they brought scarcity, a quiet, persistent reminder that survival depended as much on stored sustenance as on warmth. Peasants, whose lives were intimately bound to the rhythms of the land, prepared for the long months when fresh produce was unavailable and hunting yielded little. Food became a carefully managed resource, a tangible form of security whose presence or absence could define life or death. Preservation and preparation were therefore essential skills, as crucial to survival as layered clothing or the insulating power of straw. Grains formed the backbone of winter sustenance. Barley, oats, and rye were harvested during warmer months and stored in granaries or earthen pits, carefully shielded from moisture, pests, and freezing temperatures. These grains provided the foundation for porridges and bread, both of which were calorically dense and capable of sustaining the body over long periods. Storage was a science of its own. Containers were elevated from the floor, tightly sealed with straw or cloth, and inspected regularly. Any sign of damp or mold prompted immediate action, for a spoiled supply could mean weeks of hardship. Vegetables and roots were preserved through drying, pickling, and storage in cold but insulated spaces. Carrots, turnips, and cabbages were often buried in straw-lined pits or clay cellars, where they remained edible for months. Herbs and other plants were dried and tied in bundles, stored near the ceiling or along walls, both to conserve space and to keep them away from moisture on the floor. These preserved foods were modest in quantity, but essential, providing nutrients and variety to a diet that might otherwise be monotonous, and ensuring that essential vitamins and minerals were not entirely absent during the long winter. Meat and dairy were equally vital, though far less abundant. Pigs and goats were often raised with the explicit purpose of supplying protein during winter months. Salted or smoked meats, while simple, could last for weeks if properly stored. Milk from cows or goats was carefully managed. Some was consumed fresh, while the remainder was turned into butter or cheese, both of which preserved nutrition over extended periods. Each process required foresight and care. Cheese, for instance, was often aged in cool, dry areas, with rinds monitored to prevent spoilage. Butter was churned and stored in containers sealed with layers of cloth or wax. Every step reflected a deep knowledge of natural processes, a quiet science learned through observation and repeated practice. Eggs, though fragile, were preserved through careful timing and sometimes through simple methods such as coating in clay or storing in straw. Their value extended beyond immediate nutrition. They were a flexible ingredient used in both simple porridge and richer preparations, when other foods allowed. Even small contributions to the winter diet were celebrated, their presence reinforcing morale and a sense of preparedness. Each meal became an act of patience, calculation, and gratitude, emphasizing the peasants' reliance on both ingenuity and careful stewardship. Storage techniques were as important as the foods themselves. Granaries, clay pots, straw-lined cellars, and even small elevated shelves were all employed to reduce exposure to moisture, frost, or pests. Regular inspection was crucial. Rats, insects, or damp could decimate a winter supply if not addressed. Peasants developed subtle but effective strategies, layering materials, monitoring air circulation, and rotating stored items to ensure that nothing spoiled prematurely. This attentiveness transformed simple storage into a precise, disciplined form of environmental control, reinforcing both the physical and psychological sense of security. Cooking methods also adapted to scarcity and cold. Without abundant firewood, peasant families employed low, slow heat to make meals stretch farther. Porridges were simmered for hours, extracting maximal nutrition from grains, while stews combined preserved vegetables, salted meat, and herbs into simple but sustaining dishes. Techniques were subtle, using residual heat from a small fire, layering ingredients in insulated containers, or covering pots with cloth to retain warmth. Meals were never hurried. The process of cooking itself became an extension of survival, a deliberate practice in patience, observation, and maximization of scarce resources. Preserved foods were also organized to minimize waste. Daily rationing was a careful, almost ritualized process. Portions were distributed according to age, activity level, and health, with elders often receiving slightly smaller amounts to ensure that children and those responsible for heavy labor remained nourished. The allocation of food was both pragmatic and moral, reflecting an understanding that survival depended on balance, foresight, and shared responsibility. Every crumb, every portion was valued, and the careful management of these supplies was itself an art form, blending necessity with human ethics and empathy. Even the smallest details mattered. Herbs added flavor and medicinal value, while grains were sometimes mixed to create different textures and nutritional profiles. Preservation techniques were adapted to available resources. Smoke from cooking fires could dry herbs, cellars provided natural refrigeration, and straw served both as insulation and padding. The integration of food storage and environmental control reflected a holistic approach to survival, one that recognized the interdependence of every element in the household ecosystem. Psychological factors also played a subtle role. The sight of stored grains, jars of butter, and bundles of preserved vegetables offered reassurance against the monotony and uncertainty of winter. Rituals surrounding the inspection, preparation, and distribution of food reinforced both security and routine. Even the act of sharing a modest meal became a quiet celebration of human ingenuity and resilience, a reaffirmation that life persisted despite cold, darkness, and scarcity. Finally, peasant ingenuity extended to scavenging and supplementation. Roots and nuts could be gathered from forests, frozen fruits sometimes harvested from lingering trees, and small animals or birds trapped for immediate consumption. Every addition to the winter diet was carefully considered, integrated into storage systems, and consumed with gratitude. This constant attention to both planning and opportunism reflected a profound understanding of survival dynamics, the recognition that winter required not only endurance but also continuous adaptation, observation, and creativity. Through meticulous preservation, organization, and consumption, food became a linchpin of survival. The peasant's ability to manage grains, roots, dairy, eggs, and meat determined not only physical health but psychological resilience. Every decision, from the placement of a jar in a cool corner to the layering of straw over a vegetable pit, reflected knowledge honed over generations. In these carefully tended stores of sustenance, life found a way to endure the long frozen nights, offering a quiet testament to human ingenuity, patience, and foresight. In this way, winter foods were more than nutrition, they were lifelines, symbols of preparation, ingenuity, and resilience. They shaped daily routines, influenced household organization, and contributed to both physical and emotional well-being. Peasants survived winter not merely through warmth or clothing, but through deliberate, careful stewardship of resources, transforming scarcity into manageable systems of endurance. Food preserved and rationed with precision became both armor and assurance, a quiet but essential partner in the ongoing struggle against cold, darkness, and time. In the frozen dark nights of medieval winters, survival rarely existed in isolation. While clothing, food, and animals provided essential warmth and sustenance, it was the strength of community that often determined whether a household endured or succumbed to the cold. Peasants depended on one another not merely for labor or shared resources, but for wisdom, reassurance, and the subtle strategies that allowed life to persist when fire was scarce and the wind bit relentlessly through gaps in walls. Mutual aid became an invisible but critical network, a web of interdependence woven through necessity and shared experience. Neighbors shared firewood, often splitting the last precious logs to ensure that everyone received some warmth. Though each household managed its own supplies, generosity was a practical form of survival. The well-being of one family affected the safety of the entire community. Knowledge about insulation, animal management, and winter foods was freely exchanged. A neighbor who had mastered layering straw in sleeping areas or creating microclimates in huts could advise others, ensuring that wisdom passed from one generation to the next. This informal education was as vital as any material provision, equipping households with strategies that preserved both life and morale. Small tasks were often shared, turning labor into collective effort. Villagers assisted one another with chores that became especially demanding in winter, bringing water from distant sources before the ground froze, transporting firewood over snow-laden paths, or reinforcing shelter walls against the relentless wind. Children might accompany adults in these tasks, learning not only practical skills but also the value of cooperation. Through these interactions, communities created systems of reciprocity, where giving and receiving aid became a rhythm of daily life, quietly reinforcing resilience while strengthening social bonds. Shared meals were another form of mutual support. When possible, neighbors combined resources, preparing communal porridges, stews, or broths that stretched scarce ingredients further. Even modest gatherings around a small flame provided warmth, both physical and emotional. The presence of others, combined with the comfort of shared food, reduced the psychological burden of long dark nights. In these moments, the cold and scarcity of winter were mitigated not by fire alone, but by human connection, empathy, and shared endurance. Information was equally valuable. Weather forecasts, knowledge of hidden caches, and strategies for managing livestock or stored food circulated within the village. A simple observation about frost patterns, wind direction, or snow accumulation could inform critical adjustments in household routines. Villagers acted as both observers and communicators, their collective awareness extending the survival capacity of the community far beyond what any individual household could achieve alone. In this way, knowledge became a shared resource, silently reinforcing the invisible safety net of communal support. Mutual aid also extended to emotional resilience. Winter nights were long, dark, and isolating, and psychological endurance was as vital as physical protection. Villagers shared stories, songs, and prayers, easing fear and reinforcing social cohesion. A whispered tale of past survival, or the memory of a particularly harsh winter, conveyed both wisdom and reassurance. Children especially benefited from these shared narratives, learning coping strategies while internalizing a sense of belonging and continuity. Emotional bonds became intertwined with practical ones, creating a multi-layered network of support that extended beyond the material into the realm of human connection. Crisis management was another aspect of communal ingenuity. When illness struck, neighbors assisted in caring for the sick, ensuring that warmth, food, and basic needs were met. If an animal died, or a storage pit spoiled, advice and labor were offered to mitigate loss. Even in the harshest conditions, these small acts of assistance reinforced the community's ability to endure. Each contribution, whether material or emotional, enhanced collective resilience, allowing households to recover more quickly and maintain a fragile equilibrium against winter's unyielding challenges. Rituals and traditions reinforced these bonds. Seasonal celebrations, religious observances, or communal maintenance of structures provided opportunities for interaction and coordination. These events, often small and understated, reinforced social cohesion and fostered trust. Knowing that one could rely on neighbors for assistance, advice, or even simple companionship in darkness allowed villagers to approach winter with confidence rather than despair. These routines were subtle, but their impact on morale and coordinated survival strategies was profound, emphasizing that no household truly faced the winter alone. The practical and emotional aspects of mutual aid were inseparable. A shared task, rebuilding a fence, stacking firewood, or repairing a roof, was both a material benefit and a reinforcement of social ties. A neighbor's advice on insulating a wall or arranging bedding for warmth was both practical instruction and a gesture of trust and solidarity. Through repeated interactions, the community established norms, routines, and expectations, ensuring that cooperation became habitual and instinctive, rather than exceptional. These bonds were invisible yet enduring, creating a network of resilience that extended far beyond any single household's capabilities. Even in moments of scarcity, communities developed ingenious solutions. Food or materials might be pooled temporarily, with the understanding that contributions would be reciprocated in kind. Shared observation of weather and environmental conditions allowed villagers to anticipate frost storms or snowdrifts, adjusting routines collectively. Young and old, strong and weak, all contributed in ways suited to their abilities, creating an ecosystem of interdependence that balanced energy, skill, and resource availability. Survival was thus not merely an individual achievement, but a communal one, crafted through deliberate cooperation and shared experience. The quiet strength of these bonds was most evident during the coldest nights, when external conditions were harshest. Families huddled close, insulated by clothing, bedding, and animals, but the knowledge that neighbors were doing the same, monitoring weather, preparing supplies, and sharing resources, created a broader safety net. Even without direct interaction, this collective vigilance fostered psychological security, reducing fear and reinforcing confidence. The village became a lattice of human ingenuity and empathy, extending warmth and reassurance far beyond any single hearth or sleeping area. Ultimately, community bonds and mutual aid transformed isolation into collaboration, fear into resilience, and scarcity into coordinated survival. Peasants endured winter not solely through their individual efforts, but through their ability to give, receive, and observe within a structured network of care and shared knowledge. Every act of assistance, every shared story, and every cooperative task contributed to a broader system of endurance. In the long frozen nights, life persisted not only because of clothing, food, or animals, but because human connection created a silent, powerful, and indispensable layer of survival. While warmth could be generated through straw, animals, or layered clothing, medieval peasants also relied on subtler internal sources of heat, what might be called the hidden fires within. These were not flames that could be seen or touched, but physiological and psychological mechanisms that allowed the human body to endure long freezing nights without fire. Through careful attention to diet, movement, and mindset, peasants cultivated an inner resilience, a quiet furnace of survival that complemented external warmth and transformed vulnerability into endurance. Metabolism was the first and most fundamental of these hidden fires. The food preserved and rationed during winter months, grains, root vegetables, dairy, and occasionally meat, provided the raw energy that fueled the body's internal heat generation. Eating small, frequent portions helped maintain a steady energy flow, preventing drops in body temperature that could occur during long periods of inactivity. Every bite was deliberate, not merely nourishment, but a vital component of a self-regulating thermal system. Peasants understood, through observation and experience, that the body's internal fire required consistent fuel, and that rationing was both survival and strategy. Movement, even minimal, also generated internal warmth. Peasants engaged in small, deliberate exercises, stretching, shifting in bed, or adjusting sleeping positions, that encouraged blood circulation. These movements, subtle and almost imperceptible, maintained heat without exhausting precious energy. Even tending to animals or performing necessary chores before nightfall became part of this internal warming process. The body, in its constant negotiation with cold, became an active participant in survival, converting stored calories into steady heat, and creating a living engine capable of enduring the hours when fire was absent. Breathing played a surprisingly important role in managing internal warmth. Slow, steady breaths helped conserve energy and regulate heat distribution, while shallow or erratic breathing could allow cold to penetrate deeper into the body. Parents often instructed children in gentle rhythmic breathing, even as they settled them for the night, subtly teaching techniques that enhanced both warmth and calm. The synchronization of breathing with gentle movement, combined with layers of insulation, created a microclimate within the body, a hidden flame that persisted through darkness and cold. Psychological strategies were equally essential. The mind, trained over generations, became a tool for warmth. Peasants learned to focus attention, modulate fear, and maintain calm, recognizing that anxiety and panic could accelerate heat loss. Quiet reflection, meditation-like focus, and the rhythmic lull of daily routines helped preserve energy and maintain internal warmth. Stories, songs, and gentle conversation reinforced this effect, turning cognitive engagement into a subtle but powerful source of resilience. The hidden fire was as much mental as it was physical, a fusion of willpower, awareness, and disciplined attention. Huddling and physical closeness, while externally visible, also activated internal heat through shared warmth and tactile stimulation. The bodies of adults, children, and even animals, pressed together, created zones where heat was both produced and conserved. Yet beyond the obvious warmth, the proximity triggered physiological responses. Circulation was enhanced, extremities remained functional, and muscles stayed relaxed yet responsive. The human body, in intimate cooperation with others, generated heat that transcended simple insulation, creating a living furnace powered by connection, rhythm, and touch. Sleep itself became a carefully managed strategy for cultivating hidden warmth. Peasants timed rest periods to coincide with optimal thermal conditions, often falling asleep after gentle movement or a modest meal. Sleeping positions were adjusted to minimize exposed surfaces, and consciousness was maintained at a semi-alert level that allowed rapid adjustment to cold spots. Even the act of dreaming became integrated into survival, as calm mental states helped regulate physiological responses and prevent unnecessary energy loss. In these hours of darkness, the body's hidden fires burned steadily, quietly defending against the penetrating chill. Dietary strategies extended beyond calories to specific nutrients that supported heat production. Fat, though scarce, was particularly valued for its ability to sustain energy and generate warmth over time. Protein, in the form of dairy, eggs, or occasional meat, aided muscle function and metabolic efficiency, while root vegetables provided slow-release carbohydrates that stabilized internal temperature. Even the smallest details, the timing of meals, the combination of ingredients, and the method of preparation, contributed to maintaining these internal fires, demonstrating a sophisticated, if intuitive, understanding of physiology. The mind also transformed ordinary objects into psychological sources of warmth. Familiar textures, such as a favorite blanket, a child's garment, or a cherished bundle of straw, provided reassurance that translated into reduced stress and more efficient metabolic regulation. The perception of safety and continuity became a subtle amplifier of internal warmth, highlighting the inseparable relationship between mental state and physiological endurance. In this way, survival was a holistic experience, merging body, mind, and environment into a seamless system of resilience. Even rituals performed at night contributed to these hidden fires. Gentle songs, whispered prayers, and brief family interactions reinforced emotional stability and calm, which in turn enhanced the body's capacity to generate heat. The rhythm of breathing, the tactile reassurance of touch, and the mental focus on routine and care all fed into the hidden flames of endurance. These practices were subtle, often imperceptible, yet profoundly effective in transforming the experience of cold into manageable discomfort, rather than debilitating exposure. Through the cultivation of internal warmth, peasants demonstrated the remarkable adaptability of the human body and mind. External measures, clothing, bedding, animals, were vital, yet they were amplified exponentially by these hidden fires. The combination of careful nutrition, deliberate movement, regulated breathing, psychological focus, and social connection created a multi-layered defense against cold. Life persisted not solely because of material measures, but because humans could generate, nurture, and maintain warmth from within, turning scarcity into a manageable, even predictable, aspect of existence. In the end, the hidden fires within reflected the quiet, persistent ingenuity of medieval peasants. They were the invisible flames that allowed families to endure freezing nights without fire, a testament to the intimate knowledge of body, mind, and environment that survival demanded. In these subtle internal strategies, one glimpses a profound truth: warmth, comfort, and life itself are not merely given, they are cultivated, nurtured, and carried forward through conscious attention, practiced skill, and the enduring human will to survive. In the harsh grip of winter, survival extended beyond simple shelter or food. It required an intimate understanding of the seasons and the strategic use of clothing. Peasants relied on layered garments, carefully adapted to the extreme cold, to insulate against piercing winds and freezing temperatures. Clothing was more than a necessity, it was a form of armor, a portable microclimate that allowed life to continue despite the relentless environment. Each garment, layer, and accessory carried the accumulated wisdom of generations, reflecting careful observation, trial and error, and a subtle appreciation for both material and function. Wool was the backbone of winter attire. Its natural insulating properties, coupled with its ability to retain warmth, even when damp, made it indispensable. Peasants wore woolen tunics, cloaks, and leggings, often doubled or tripled in critical areas. Over these layers, linen or coarse fabrics provided protection against drafts and abrasion, while also serving as an additional buffer between the skin and the biting cold. The interplay of textures, densities, and layering created a wearable system of thermal management, finely tuned to balance insulation, mobility, and durability. Layering was a practiced art. Each layer served a distinct purpose. The innermost absorbed sweat, the middle retained body heat, and the outer shielded against wind and precipitation. Hoods and hats were particularly important, as much heat escapes from the head. Gloves, mittens, and socks were often made from wool, or lined with softer materials to protect extremities. Scarves, wraps, and shawls further insulated the neck and shoulders, while belts or ties ensured that layers remained snug and effective. Every adjustment, fold or tuck reflected a quiet attention to detail, a subtle yet critical factor in enduring the coldest nights. Clothing was also adapted to the household environment and available materials. Animal hides, fur, and thickly woven fabrics supplemented wool when necessary, providing additional warmth where resources allowed. Footwear, often leather, was lined with straw or cloth to provide insulation against frozen ground. Even small details, the positioning of a fold, the addition of padding, or the layering of a patch, could dramatically affect comfort and survivability. Peasants were keen observers of material properties, exploiting every opportunity to transform scarce resources into functional protection against winter's severity. Seasonal adaptations extended beyond clothing to the organization of daily life. Peasants timed work, chores, and animal care according to daylight hours and temperature patterns. Heavy labor was often completed in the warmer parts of the day, while evenings were reserved for rest, tending to animals, and preparation for night. Clothing adapted to these routines, allowing flexibility for work outside and warmth inside. Garments were layered for mobility, with pieces added or removed as conditions demanded. The careful orchestration of clothing, movement, and timing created a dynamic system of seasonal survival. The psychology of dressing was as important as the physical properties of the garments. Layering, adjustment, and preparation provided reassurance and a sense of agency. Knowing that each coat, cloak, or wrap had been properly arranged, allowed peasants to approach winter with confidence rather than fear. This mental comfort, subtle though it was, reinforced physical resilience, demonstrating the inseparable link between psychological state and thermal endurance. The act of dressing became a ritual, a nightly affirmation that both life and warmth could be sustained. Children received particular attention in seasonal clothing. Their smaller bodies lost heat more quickly, and their activity levels varied. Parents wrapped them carefully in multiple layers, ensuring that extremities were protected and that blankets or straw were positioned strategically. Teaching children the principles of layering, adjustment, and the importance of insulating extremities was part of a quiet, continuous education in survival. These lessons, though often transmitted gently and without words, carried wisdom that would guide the next generation through winters equally harsh and unrelenting. Clothing was also adapted to social and economic realities. Not every family had access to fine fabrics or extensive layers, so resourcefulness became essential. Patches were applied with care, furs were shared or reused, and clothing was often multifunctional, serving as bedding, insulation, or even makeshift storage when not worn. This adaptability reflected a broader principle of survival, the recognition that function often outweighed aesthetics, and that every resource had to be maximized. Even the simplest garment became part of a layered strategy for life and warmth. Animal skins and furs were particularly valued for extreme cold. Goat, sheep, and even rabbit skins provided insulating layers that could be worn, draped over sleeping areas, or used as additional bedding. These natural materials were not merely functional, they were carefully treated to maintain flexibility, softness, and thermal properties. Peasants developed techniques for scraping, drying, and shaping hides to enhance warmth without compromising mobility. In this way, clothing was both a practical shield and a subtle art form, blending natural materials, skill, and observation into effective protection against the elements. Seasonal adaptation also involved anticipating weather shifts. Peasants monitored clouds, wind, and frost patterns, adjusting clothing layers accordingly. Heavy snow might require additional wraps, while milder days allowed removal of layers to prevent overheating during labor. The dynamic interaction between body, clothing, and environment required constant attention and subtle adjustments. Survival depended not merely on having clothing, but on knowing how to employ it effectively in response to ever-changing conditions. Finally, clothing and seasonal adaptations reinforced communal knowledge. Techniques for layering, padding, and insulating were shared among neighbors, refined across generations, and subtly adjusted according to local microclimates. Patterns of dress reflected both practical wisdom and cultural continuity, blending survival strategies with identity and tradition. The careful orchestration of garments, movement, and timing became a cornerstone of winter endurance, demonstrating that clothing was not merely material protection, but a profound embodiment of knowledge, experience, and adaptive intelligence. Through careful layering, strategic use of available materials, and attentiveness to both body and environment, peasants transformed clothing into a tool for survival. Every fold, stitch, and layer was part of a carefully orchestrated system, turning scarcity into resilience and the biting cold into a manageable challenge. Seasonal adaptations and clothing were silent but vital allies in the struggle against winter, shaping routines, protecting life, and reinforcing the quiet ingenuity that allowed medieval families to endure nights that would have overwhelmed unprepared bodies. As the long and weary grip of winter finally loosened, a subtle transformation began to ripple across the medieval countryside. The change was never abrupt, never a sudden burst of warmth or light, but rather a slow, patient unfolding, like the turning of a great, ancient wheel. For peasants who had endured months of cold nights without fire, each small sign of spring carried weight far beyond its physical presence. A softened breeze through the thatched walls, the faint drip of snowmelt from eaves, or the first cry of a bird returning from migration, all became heralds of hope, signals that survival had meaning, that endurance had a reward. The arrival of spring was not merely the passing of a season, it was a renewal, both physical and spiritual, of life itself. The soil, hardened for months by frost, began to thaw. Fields that had lain dormant stirred with potential, promising grain, vegetables, and sustenance once more. Streams, long muted by ice, sang again, with flowing water carrying both nourishment and music through the landscape. For peasants who had spent winter conserving every ember of strength, this awakening was almost miraculous, a reminder that hardship was temporary, and that cycles of renewal governed even the harshest years. The first task of spring was often the tending of animals. Livestock, weakened by months of confinement and limited fodder, emerged from barns and shelters into the open air. Cows, goats, and sheep stretched stiff limbs. Chickens pecked eagerly at thawing ground. Their survival was a triumph in itself, proof of careful stewardship and resilience through scarcity. Peasants tended to them with both relief and urgency, understanding that the vitality of their animals was tied directly to their own survival. Fresh milk, wool, and eggs meant not only nourishment but the beginnings of abundance after long months of deprivation. Fields required immediate attention as well. Men, women, and even children worked side by side to prepare the earth for planting. The soil, heavy and damp from melted snow, had to be turned, drained, and fertilized. This was exhausting work, but the promise of growth infused it with energy. Each seed sown was more than a gesture of agriculture. It was a declaration of hope, a statement of trust in the natural cycles that govern their lives. The simple act of planting after winter carried profound weight. It meant the future would hold food, warmth, and continuity. Spring also transformed diet. Gone were the monotonous meals of salted meat, dried grains, and preserved vegetables. In their place emerged fresh greens, wild herbs, and tender shoots gathered from fields and forests. Nettles, dandelions, and early cabbages offered vitamins long absent from winter diets, reviving bodies weary from scarcity. For peasants, these humble plants were not merely food but medicine, replenishing strength and health. Eating them was both nourishment and ritual, a symbolic breaking of winter's hold on the body. The psychological shift of spring was just as profound as the physical one. After months of long dark nights, where silence and cold pressed heavily against thatched walls, the lengthening days felt like a balm. Light lingered longer, warming not just the air but the spirit. Villagers gathered more frequently outdoors, sharing stories, laughter, and songs. The oppressive weight of winter's darkness lifted, replaced by a sense of connection and vitality. Where winter had fostered caution, silence, and endurance, spring encouraged openness, energy, and renewal of community bonds. Religious and cultural practices amplified this sense of rebirth. In many regions, the coming of spring was celebrated with festivals, prayers, and rituals that honored both survival and new beginnings. Feasts, however modest, marked the change of season, reinforcing gratitude for life preserved through hardship. Churches and village gatherings resonated with hymns and blessings, intertwining spiritual renewal with agricultural labor. To the peasant, spring was not only nature's awakening but also a divine affirmation, a reassurance that their endurance had meaning in both earthly and heavenly realms. Children especially embodied the spirit of renewal. After months of confinement indoors, they spilled into fields and pathways, chasing one another, laughing, and rediscovering the simple joys of movement and play. Their energy became a symbol of resilience, a reminder that life did not merely persist through winter but re-emerged stronger, brighter, and more joyful. Parents watching them felt both relief and pride, relief that their children had survived the trials of cold and illness, and pride that their family had endured together. Yet renewal did not erase memory. The hardships of winter lingered in stories, scars, and lessons. Families recounted the struggles they had overcome, embedding them in oral tradition. These tales were not told with bitterness but with quiet reverence, as reminders of resilience and wisdom to be passed on. They reinforced communal knowledge, how to insulate against the cold, how to ration food, how to care for the sick, and how to endure without fire. In this way, the memory of winter's challenges became part of spring's renewal, ensuring that future generations would be prepared when the cycle began again. The natural world itself echoed these themes of continuity. Rivers, once frozen and silent, carved new channels with their thaw, shaping landscapes and nourishing fields. Trees, barren for months, blossomed with tender buds, foreshadowing fruit and shade in the months ahead. Birds returned in flocks, their calls filling the air with sound after long stretches of silence. Even the air itself seemed transformed, carrying scents of damp soil, blossoms, and new grass. For the peasant, these changes were not mere aesthetics. They were assurances of life's persistence, of nature's enduring generosity. As spring advanced, the contrast with winter became more striking. Where once survival had meant layering against the cold and rationing food with precision, now it meant embracing growth, abundance, and energy. Work shifted from conservation to expansion, from guarding against loss to cultivating plenty. The household rhythms that had contracted inward during the cold months now stretched outward, aligning with the sun, the soil, and the community at large. Every action, from planting seeds to gathering herbs, resonated with purpose and possibility. Yet perhaps the deepest renewal was found in gratitude. For peasants, survival through a winter without fire was no small achievement. Each spring, therefore, was not taken for granted, but embraced with reverence. gratitude-infused prayers, meals and gatherings. Even the simplest joys, a warm breeze, a fresh egg, a field turning green, were acknowledged as blessings. In this way, renewal was not merely a return to life but a conscious celebration of it. The dawn of spring was both an ending and a beginning, the closing of one struggle and the opening of another cycle. Though peasants knew that winter would inevitably return, they also understood that life had rhythms, and that each season brought its own trials and rewards. To endure winter was to claim spring, to welcome spring was to prepare, in time for winter again. This awareness did not diminish their joy, but deepened it, grounding it in wisdom and continuity. Thus the peasant's survival was not only about making it through cold nights without fire, it was about finding renewal in the rhythms of nature, in the resilience of the body, in the bonds of community, and in the persistence of spirit. Spring was the reward for patience, the balm for hardship, and the assurance that even after the darkest nights, life could and would begin anew. When we look back at how medieval peasants endured the long freezing winters without fire, it is tempting to view their world as distant, alien, and utterly removed from our own. After all, we live in an age of central heating, electric lights, insulated walls, and instant access to food from every corner of the globe. Yet beneath these differences lies a thread of continuity. Their struggles, their resilience, and their ingenuity hold lessons that resonate far beyond their time. To understand how they survived is not only to glimpse their endurance, but also to reflect on our own lives, our vulnerabilities, and the meaning of comfort in a modern world. The first lesson is one of adaptation. Peasants did not have the power to control their environment in the way we do today. They could not summon heat at the turn of a dial or ward off hunger with a quick purchase at the market. Instead, they adapted creatively, patiently, and persistently to whatever nature imposed upon them. They layered their clothing, sealed their homes with straw, gathered together for warmth, and relied on routines designed for survival. In our age, where convenience often substitutes for resilience, their example reminds us of the human capacity to endure by adjusting rather than resisting. Comfort is fragile when it depends entirely on technology. Resilience is enduring when it is grounded in adaptability. A second lesson lies in community. Winter survival in medieval villages was never an individual endeavor. Families huddled together under shared blankets. Neighbors helped one another repair roofs or share scarce food, and entire communities worked collectively to endure hardship. In contrast, modern life often emphasizes independence and isolation, yet we are reminded during crises, whether storms, blackouts, or global events, that survival is strongest when shared. The peasant's experience teaches us that warmth was not only physical, but also social. The embrace of kin, the presence of neighbors, and the strength of communal bonds provided sustenance that no hearth alone could offer. There is also a lesson in frugality and preparation. For peasants, the line between survival and catastrophe was drawn by careful planning, the storing of grain, the drying of herbs, the curing of meat. Every surplus from the summer months was a lifeline for winter. Wastefulness was not a luxury they could afford, for a single spoiled sack of grain could mean hunger weeks later. In our era of abundance and excess, where food is often discarded without thought, their discipline offers perspective. The value of preparation, of mindful consumption, and of respecting resources is timeless, reminding us that what we have today is not guaranteed tomorrow. Another lesson emerges in the rhythm of patience. Modern life is defined by immediacy, instant communication, instant comfort, instant gratification. The peasant world moved according to a slower cadence, dictated by seasons, weather, and necessity. Winter nights stretched long, and tasks were measured not in hours but in cycles, of light and darkness, cold and thaw, hunger and harvest. From this slower rhythm came an acceptance of endurance, a recognition that hardship would pass, and that renewal always followed struggle. For us accustomed to speed, their patience serves as a gentle reminder. Not all difficulties can be rushed through. Some must be endured with quiet strength until the season itself changes. There is wisdom, too, in the way peasants valued simple comforts. A woolen blanket, a hot bowl of pottage, the warmth of a sleeping animal. These were luxuries measured not by wealth, but by presence. In our world of endless variety, and constant consumption, satisfaction often escapes us because comfort becomes expected rather than cherished. The peasant's survival reminds us that even the smallest warmth, the faintest flame, or the simplest meal can be deeply meaningful when framed by gratitude. To see comfort as a gift rather than a given is to reclaim a kind of richness often lost in modern abundance. Resilience in their world was not grand or heroic. It was quiet, repetitive, and often invisible. It was the act of patching a draft in the thatch roof, of rationing the last turnip, of whispering prayers while listening to the wind howl outside. Survival was made of countless small decisions, each one an affirmation of life. Today we often associate resilience with dramatic feats or extraordinary acts, but the peasants teach us otherwise, that resilience is found in consistency, in persistence, in choosing endurance in the face of daily struggle. It is in the quiet refusal to surrender, even when comfort is absent. Another enduring lesson is humility before nature. Medieval peasants understood, in a way few of us do now, that they were subject to forces far greater than themselves. They respected the cold, the snow, the rhythm of the earth. Their survival depended not on conquering nature, but on living with it, reading its signs, honoring its cycles, and preparing for its changes. Modern society, with its machines and technologies, often imagines itself above nature. Yet storms still arrive, power grids still fail, and food systems remain vulnerable. The peasant's humility offers us perspective. We are not separate from the earth, but part of it, and our survival remains intertwined with its rhythms. The hardships of medieval winter also reveal a deeper lesson about perspective. What we consider hardship today, an interrupted internet connection, a broken heater, or a delayed delivery, pales beside the struggles of a family huddling through a night of freezing cold without fire. This is not to belittle modern discomforts, but rather to place them in context. Their endurance sharpens our appreciation for what we have. It reminds us that comfort is not owed, that warmth is not guaranteed, and that gratitude can be cultivated by remembering those who lived with less. Finally, the peasant's survival carries a lesson about the meaning of renewal. Winter was not simply endured, it was embraced as part of a greater cycle. The patience of waiting, the endurance of cold, and the discipline of scarcity were all balanced by the joy of spring's arrival, the abundance of harvest, and the celebrations of community. To endure winter was to earn spring, to know scarcity was to taste abundance more fully. In our modern age, where cycles are often blurred by artificial abundance and constant supply, this perspective holds wisdom. Hardship deepens joy, and renewal is sweetest when it follows endurance. In reflecting upon these lessons, it becomes clear that the medieval peasant experience is not a distant relic, but a mirror, one that reveals both how far we have come and how much we still share. Their survival teaches us resilience, patience, gratitude, and humility. It shows us that comfort is not the absence of struggle, but the appreciation of warmth in the midst of cold. It reminds us that we are strongest not alone but together. And perhaps most importantly, it invites us to reimagine hardship, not as a curse but as a teacher, a stern but wise companion that prepares us for renewal. Thus, when we think of those long winter nights without fire, we need not see them only as bleak chapters of history. We may see them as lessons whispered across centuries, urging us to live with more awareness, more gratitude, and more resilience in our own time. Their story is not only about survival, it is about what it means to be human, bound to the cycles of nature, reliant upon one another, and capable of enduring far more than we often believe. When we arrive at the end of this journey, when the last embers of our exploration glow faintly, and the voices of medieval peasants seem to drift back into the silence of time, we are left with a deeper question. Beyond the practicalities of survival, beyond the blankets, the straw, and the communal gatherings in the cold, what truly enabled these men and women to endure? The answer lies not merely in the methods they used, but in something far greater, the timeless resilience of the human spirit. This spirit is not bound to one era, nor to one class, nor to one geography. It is a flame that has burned in every age, through every hardship, across every landscape, where humanity has struggled and hoped. In the medieval village, this spirit manifested in quiet acts of endurance, in the mother rocking her child through a freezing night, in the father waking early to mend a thatched roof before the snow pressed it flat, in the children laughing together, finding joy despite the cold. These moments were not grand in scale, but they were powerful in meaning. They revealed that survival is not only about enduring the elements, it is about refusing to let despair extinguish hope. The human spirit is, at its heart, a paradox. It is fragile, subject to fear, doubt, and pain, and yet it is also unyielding, capable of strength, even when strength seems impossible. The peasants of medieval Europe embodied this paradox daily. Their world was defined by limits, limited food, limited warmth, limited safety, and yet within those limits, they found ways to expand life, through song, through faith, through community, and through simple persistence. Their lives teach us that the human spirit does not require abundance to thrive. It requires only meaning, connection, and hope. Faith played a central role in sustaining this spirit. For many peasants, the long winters were not only physical challenges, but also spiritual tests. They prayed by candlelight, whispered hymns in the cold air of village churches, and saw in the rhythm of the seasons the presence of divine will. To them, endurance was not only survival, it was an act of faith, a way of aligning human struggle with something eternal. Whether or not one shares their beliefs, there is something deeply moving in the way they found comfort in the unseen. Their spirit was lifted by stories, by rituals, by the conviction that suffering was never meaningless, but part of a larger design. Storytelling, too, sustained the human spirit. In the flicker of lamplight, as winds rattled the shutters, families told tales of ancestors, of saints, of heroes who overcame impossible odds. Children fell asleep to the rhythm of words, carried into dreams by stories that promised resilience, justice, and renewal. These stories were not mere diversions, they were lifelines, shaping how communities perceived themselves, and reminding them that hardship was not the end, but a passage. The human spirit, nourished by stories, found in them the courage to keep moving forward, even when the night was at its coldest. There is also an undeniable beauty in the way the human spirit finds strength in togetherness. No peasant family could endure winter entirely on its own. Neighbors repaired roofs for each other, shared food when supplies ran low, and gathered in common spaces to share warmth. This collective strength demonstrates that the human spirit flourishes when it reaches beyond the self. It is not isolation that keeps us alive, but connection. The peasants' lives remind us that resilience is communal, not solitary, that humanity's greatest strength lies in its ability to endure together. But perhaps the greatest testament to the timeless human spirit is its ability to transform suffering into meaning. For peasants, hardship was not simply endured, it was given a place in the story of life. The cold was not just cold, it was a reminder of the cycle of seasons. Hunger was not only hunger, it was a test of patience until the harvest returned. Even death itself was framed not as annihilation, but as transition, woven into the faith and narratives that sustained them. By giving meaning to suffering, they transformed despair into endurance, and endurance into strength. When we look back upon their world, it is easy to focus on what they lacked, yet in doing so we risk missing what they possessed. They held a deep awareness of life's fragility, and in turn a profound appreciation for its blessings. A loaf of bread, a patch of sunlight, through a cottage window, a moment of laughter with family, these were treasures beyond measure. The human spirit, when stripped of excess, reveals its true wealth, the ability to find joy in the smallest gifts, to recognize the sacredness of survival itself. This spirit did not vanish with the medieval world, it continues unbroken into our own time. It is present in every moment when someone endures hardship with quiet strength, when families gather to support one another, when communities rebuild after disaster, when individuals find light in the midst of despair. The technologies and comforts may change, but the essence remains the same. Humanity's story is at its core one of survival through resilience, creativity, and hope. The medieval peasants remind us not of a lost past, but of a living continuity. The timeless human spirit also teaches us humility. It whispers that we are stronger than we imagine, yet also more dependent on one another than we often admit. It urges us to recognize that no matter how advanced our society becomes, we remain vulnerable to the rhythms of nature, the uncertainty of life, and the inevitability of struggle. And yet within that vulnerability lies a gift, the chance to discover resilience, to practice compassion, to remember that survival itself is sacred. And so as we conclude this journey through the frozen nights of medieval Europe, we return to the quiet but enduring truth. The flame of the human spirit has never gone out. It burned in the peasants who pressed close together for warmth, in the mothers who whispered comfort to their children, in the fathers who braved the cold to ensure their families endured. It burns still in us, whenever we face darkness and refuse to let it consume us, whenever we share warmth with others, whenever we find strength in the very act of continuing. The timeless human spirit is not a relic of history, it is the inheritance of all who live. It binds us to those who came before, and it carries us forward into whatever lies ahead. The peasant's survival without fire is more than a story of hardship. It is a reminder that within us always lies a flame that no winter can extinguish. If you want, I can also create a version with subtle paragraph breaks and rhythm.